This week, we span the globe to bring you our most daring episode yet. Join us for all the thrills, spills, and chills when Evel Knieval meets ABC's Wide World of Sports. Battle of the Network shows. Join Rick Brooks and Mike Kogel as they explore the TV of the 70s and 80s through hand-picked episodes of their favorite and not-so-favorite series.
Welcome to Battle of the Network shows. I'm Mike.
And I'm Rick. Hello, everybody.
And today we're going to get into something we get into every now and then, which is the world of sports and sports television.
The wide world of sports.
Yeah, this time the wide world of sports. Also, weird celebrities of yore, in this case, Evel Knievel. But we're going to start with the wide world of sports, and I think Rick has some things to say about that.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to Evel. He's one of the legends of ABC Wide World of Sports, and interestingly, maybe one of the personalities most associated with that program. But even though it's been off the air for quite a while now, about 20 some years as a regular show, the ABC Wide World of Sports title and the brand is still around and still being used by Disney, which owns ESPN, ABC, and all that now. But it started out as an anthology show covering all kinds of sports. So it aired from 1961 to 1998, mostly a show on Saturdays, sometimes on Sundays as well. And 1961 is obviously a little bit before our era, but it's interesting to me to look back on Wide World of Sports and the origins of it and what it became. But you also have to think about how much different television and sports on television especially were different back in the early 60s when this started. Roone Arledge, an executive, later an executive with ABC Sports and then took over ABC News, really an icon in the broadcasting industry. He didn't invent Wide World of Sports, but he is pretty much the one who developed it. This idea of having an anthology Saturday late afternoons, probably like 4 to 7 kind of in that window, and having all kinds of different sports. As they said, they span the globe, and just all kinds of different events. It started out with track and field on April 29th, 1961, but over the years it had things like Wimbledon, the Indy 500, the Daytona 500, all big events that now get their own branding and their own presentation on network sports or even cable sports now. But in the early days of sports, you would fold these kind of events into that wide world of sports umbrella. The whole appeal of it was that it was an anthology and you'd see all kinds of things. So in addition to those big events, you'd see things like barrel jumping, wrist wrestling, even Mexican cliff diving. And of course, over the years, you'd have boxing. And maybe the two people most identified with Wide World of Sports, besides host Jim McKay and behind the scenes people like Roone Arledge, I think would be Muhammad Ali and Howard Cosell, who were on many times, whether it be actual fights or interview segments. So there's a big rich history of Wide World of Sports, which I think ESPN used to exploit a little bit more, as we'll talk about in our look at Evel Knievel later. But there's so many things to talk about. You know, we wanted to focus on Evel because he's such a unique personality and also epitomizes the 1970s. But there were just all kinds of things. You could turn in any Saturday and see anything. And a lot of times, though, they were taped events. Nowadays, I think we think of sports as being live TV, and people aren't interested in watching taped events on sports or taped sports events on TV. But despite a lot of the innovations Roone Arledge came up with, or was credited with, and his team with like using satellite television, using satellites to broadcast events from all over the world, they did a lot of things that were taped, including some of the stuff we're going to talk about, some of these events that we're going to talk about today. And me personally, I was a big sports fan growing up, but I did not watch Wide World of Sports. So I was aware of it. It always seemed on, but it was something like, to me, it seemed something like older people watched. It didn't seem all that interesting to me. So even though I was watching like sports, Mike, I'd be more interested in watching like a baseball game or something on Saturday or college football.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it being on, just like taking up all of Saturday afternoon. I don't remember watching it a lot. Maybe my dad would have it on. The Globetrotters would be on, and I would watch then and then get frustrated by the format because it didn't stick with one thing.
Yes.
Like it would show a little bit of the Globetrotters and then go away to, mountain climbing or something and come back. And so you had to sit through a lot of stuff I didn't care about just to see them throw a bucket of confetti or something.
Frankly, I think that was a big appeal of the show was that there was nothing else on.
Yeah.
There weren't other sports on, so you kind of had to watch it. I think nowadays you'll watch what sport you want to watch, but back then you would watch Wide World of Sports because it was sports and it was on. And you didn't have, especially looking at Saturdays, you didn't have every college football game on all day like you do now. And I think
Right.
that's probably one reason why this format isn't used as much today, even though it was on 37 years and spawned imitators like CBS Sports Spectacular and NBC Sports World.
Because they showed such a variety. I mean, in a way, they showed a lot of that stuff that sort of ESPN. I don't know if they get made fun of for anymore, but used to, like the sort of odder things, like, well, you mentioned some already, but like, like the lumberjack games and things like that.
Right, like gimmick sports.
Yeah, although in the 25th anniversary special, Jim McKay tried to clarify exactly what qualified something to be on the show. I didn't really follow what he meant, but there's some line between legit and not legit that he drew.
Yes, he did, and I think it was always explicit even from the beginning, at least in Roone Arledge's mind. And I think the way that they promoted it to the network and sponsors was that this was going to be show business, and I think his idea was to bring elements of show business into sports. So instead of just, okay, the camera is here to record the event, some of the production techniques, many used in other sports too, and not necessarily invented by ABC or Wide World of Sports, like instant replay, whipping around to different things and kind of giving this sense of urgency or things like that, and making a buffet of sporting events. I guess it was all designed to create this entertainment atmosphere and make it more of a variety show, like you're saying. And I think we both watched this 1986 25th anniversary special, which I think was originally aired in prime time. And like you said, they tried to put that in context, and I think they did it sort of in a sense that they introduced and showed many more legitimate athletes. But at the same time, they also gave a segment that made clear, like, okay, this wasn't just these major sports, but some of these more offbeat sports were also included. So I thought it was a good reminder that, yeah, this has always been there from the beginning. It's not necessarily just Olympic level sports or things like that, or sports that are competed in the Olympics. There's all these other oddball ones too.
Right, and some of them were only odd because they were unique to different countries. Like sumo wrestling is not really odd. I mean, that's a legitimate sport with a long history in Japan, but to Americans, it's kind of odd, or it was, because of the size of the wrestlers and because it's somewhere else. But that seems like a part of the show too, is sort of showing the world of sports, that it's not just football and baseball.
Right. The one thing that I thought was unique about that special too was that as well as good a job as they did of putting some of those sports in context, like I just mentioned, it seemed bizarre to me. Right. I mean, it was almost like this black tie event, and they had people like in a stage setting.
Right.
Jim McKay, who was one of the most revered sportscasters of all time, was the host of the show, and he was fine. But they would do things like introduce a lot of like the gymnasts that have been on the show in the background and have them stand up and take a bow. And to me, that was really awkward because that wasn't at all what the show was about. Like the show business was still rooted in sports, whereas this was making it look like this kind of pseudo, almost an award ceremony. I thought that was kind of bizarre.
Yeah, and at the end they brought out, I don't know, like 40 people or something
Yeah.
to be on stage, and he's like rapidly reading them off. Well, I guess the show too would use music to dramatize things, but since this was 1986, so they were using some of the cheesiest music of the time,
Yeah.
like the David Foster St. Elmo's Fire
Yes.
instrumental, and I admit I fast forwarded through when the gymnast was doing the routine to the greatest love of all, or the Whitney Houston song.
Yes, and of course, 1986, we're still in the throes of the dominant U.S. performance in the 1984 Olympics,
Yeah.
and gymnastics was a big part of that. Mary Lou Retton was, a national hero, and ABC had just broadcast those Olympics, and it wasn't quite. We weren't to the point where NBC now is basically the Olympic network. But ABC was still a big player as far as that competition goes, and I think that's one of the reasons they were emphasizing gymnastics so much at the time. But that also reminds me of a reason why I didn't watch this show or Wide World of Sports in general. I just wasn't interested in those sports outside of the Olympic context. I think 1984 is the first year I really remember being really conscious of the Olympics, and I would watch them. And I was a big fan of Carl Lewis and sort of the pageantry and around the Los Angeles Olympics, that the fact that they were in the United States, I remember thinking was great. But outside of that Olympic context, I really had no interest in watching something like just high jumping, or to go to like a Winter Olympic sport, something like downhill skiing. I just wasn't interested in watching that. To me, it felt like kind of an older show, just sports that I wasn't interested in, and I always had a sense that it was kind of a little bit how we talked about greatest sports legends. That sort of aesthetic is, the middle-aged man in his den, maybe with a cold one, just kind of unwinding and maybe coming back from a round of golf or cutting the grass or something and sitting and just watching it again, just because it's sports and it's on. So this is what I'm going to watch.
Yeah. But then, I mean, in this special, they spent, I mean, gymnastics was like the first thing they covered. And they also spent a good deal of time on figure skating, not to stereotype too much, but those both seem like, especially because they were mostly talking about the female competitors, things geared more towards a female audience. And I wonder if that was one of the goals of the show, too, to have a broad audience and not just the middle aged man.
Quite possibly. I think that's an excellent point, and that special certainly seemed to be doing that with, like you mentioned, some of the music choices.
Yeah.
It wasn't like all aggressive rock music. It seemed more like inspirational music.
Yeah. They saved that for Evil's
Yes.
montage. But the other thing it made me think is that, and I don't know if this is true, but maybe the Wild World of Sports was a pioneer in sort of the sports as storytelling concept that I think is kind of pervasive in even in just regular broadcasts now.
Yes.
Trying to come up with the narrative of what's going on, and it's like a weird again, I'm being very broad here, but a safe place for men to be sentimental
Hmm.
in the context of sports.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, this special in particular had a lot of sentimentality to it. But you think about that, especially with you see that with the Olympics a lot. But they're always trying to get into the human story of the athletes and whatever dramatic thing they went through, rather than just calling the game.
The thrill of victory, the agony of defeat.
Yep.
And, as they famously intoned at the beginning of each episode. And yes, this special had many features, like within the special, just instead of showing highlights, they would have interviews and things that were shot and produced like you said, something that we would see during the Olympics now, and also within sporting events themselves, as opposed to, okay, let's just see a baseball game. Now, every producer has to come up with some kind of narrative, their keys to the game, and then a lot of times sports broadcasts will try to, they'll work their production around that narrative rather than just showing the action, much to my frustration at times. But I think that's an couple of excellent points by you. But I think, yes, Wide World of Sports is probably where a lot of this started, just the whole notion of creating storylines and focusing on them and producing around that and using that format where you're switching back and forth between them. You have the ability, when you're doing taped events, you have the ability to do that. And nowadays, of course, you can't do that sort of thing, partly because people don't want to watch. It's with the internet and things like that, the dissemination of information, results of events get around. There's that. People, I think, more expect spontaneity from their sporting events. They want it live and maybe aren't as accepting as taped sporting events. And of course, the fact that there's this proliferation of cable television, sports on cable. There's so much demand for product that you can't snap up a lot of these events like ABC did. I mean, I think they were able to get rights to a lot of things because who else was going to show them?
Right.
And now you've got everybody showing this kind of stuff. I mean, there's sports channels around that I'm sure that I haven't even heard of broadcasting a lot of this stuff that in the past would have been on one of these sports anthology programs on the network.
I can think of some things that still are like taped and edited that and probably would have been on there, like the World's Strongest Man or some of these other sort of competition things where they sort of whittle out a lot of elements of the competition so they can give you it in 45 minutes instead of the 3 hours or whatever it took.
Right, and in fact, there's always it seems like maybe not so much now. I think maybe we've moved past it a little bit, or people collectively decided to just forget about it. But it seems like there's always debate over the Olympics, especially if they're in a different time zone. There's a divide between people that want to see as much programming live as possible, and then the network, usually these days NBC, which would prefer to put things in a primetime window and control their own storylines, control their narrative, and give you a broadcast built around what they want to highlight. And now, with so many different options, they can put on one of their auxiliary channels, they can put the live events, but still have this taped package stuff with heavy on the features on their main feed. And usually they get a lot of viewers with it, so it works. But I think a lot of that started back in the day with Wide World of Sports, and then you became things where like, okay, well, it's not live, but it's plausibly live. The infamous description of Olympic coverage, I think in the 90s when that started. There's always going to be debate about that, but you're absolutely right that in some of these sports that aren't necessarily team sports, sports with a lot of different heats, rounds, things like that, you can argue that there's a very, very small audience that would want to even see that live.
Right. Yeah. And they might be in attendance if they can get to Singapore to see the world's strongest man.
That's right.
It also struck me that there was a certain journalistic quality to some of that stuff too, or at least the way they portrayed some of it. The sort of like political things that were going on, or goodwill ambassador sort of things between the U.S. and China, and table tennis bringing people together.
Yeah,
Which is both, so that has a slightly sentimental angle to it too, but is also finding a way to report on world events.
right. And ABC was the network that aired the Munich Olympics, which had the tragedy of the Israeli athletes being massacred, and that led to kind of an unprecedented live sports moment with Jim McKay kind of anchoring their coverage and merging of sports and news. And I think that probably changed a lot of sports coverage, and especially international sports coverage, to come for the rest of the 70s. I think that did have a big part in it. But I do think, to their credit, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think when looking back at some of the events and footage of some of the coverage, I'm impressed by ABC trying to treat journalistically a lot of these sporting events, but also within some of these events that we talked about, treating them seriously. I think I didn't see a lot of footage of them mocking the events that they were covering,
Right.
which I think would have been ridiculous. I mean, now you can look back and like a program like Cheap Seats or something on ESPN Classic would mock footage like this. But I was watching Keith Jackson doing like a celebrity demolition derby. And this is, legendary college football announcer Keith Jackson. And he's got a little chuckle in his voice when he's talking about it. But he's not mocking the competitors, and he's acting like it means something to the people that are participating in it. I think that's to ABC's credit. I think they did make an effort to present these as serious events. Yeah, with some show business and everything, and try to make it interesting, but never with like an ironic tilt to the coverage on these events.
Yeah. Now, do you think Wide World of Sports in any way influenced the format of Laugh Olympics?
I absolutely do. I think it may have been some Olympic coverage in general, but yes.
Whenever the last time I had Boomerang and watched an episode or two of that, it definitely reminded me of it, because they would cut away from things and cut from one competition to another competition or something,
Yes,
and not show you everything,
right.
even though it was a cartoon.
Yeah, which would be kind of frustrating, actually.
Yeah.
And I think Mildew Wolf, was originally considered to be one of the original broadcasters, along with Bill Fleming on ABC in the 1960s. But he later got his shot at Laugh Olympics and proved that, yeah, he was capable of doing legitimate sports.
Yeah. You know what they didn't talk about in the special were the yellow coats.
No, they didn't.
Iconic ABC Sports yellow coats.
Maybe they should have given some of those out as honorary party favors, or maybe they had them in the gift bags for everybody backstage. Bart Connor was probably happy to swing by and get some swag, and including an ABC yellow jacket.
Yeah, I mean, they look like nice jackets. I don't know if they are.
Yeah.
Remember, I mean, that was the way. News teams and sports teams used to have sort of uniforms, or sports broadcast teams.
They did. They were often classier than the uniforms that we saw on the field.
Yeah.
And ABCs were certainly as well known. Those blazers or jackets were as well known as probably any broadcast television entity back in the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah, now it's just guys wearing suits.
Yeah.
How are we supposed to know they're the announcers if we just see them on the sideline? You don't.
Blend in otherwise.
Yeah.
Are we coming up with our Battle of the Network shows Blazers soon?
We should, yeah. Have to look into that. Blazers and the little squares for the microphones.
Yes, I'd be in favor of both of those for sure.
Although, frankly, sometimes it's too hot to wear a blazer. If Jim McKay and Keith Jackson can do it, Howard Cosell even. Now, Don Meredith in the Evel Knieval segments we watched seems to have a unique ABC jumpsuit on and cowboy hat.
I was impressed by that. Don Meredith made many things look stylish, maybe more stylish than they actually were. But yeah, Dandy Don was rocking quite the outfit in that, wasn't he?
Yeah. And Howard always referred to him as Dandy Don Meredith.
Yeah.
And how courageous he was.
Yeah.
Although that seemed slightly mocking.
I think you're right. I think that was tongue-in-cheek. There might have been some liquid courage involved by Don Meredith.
Yeah. Iced tea, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Lipton's tea.
Right.
Now, I'm not sure if we're ready to transition right to Evil yet, but I do want to note before we do that if I recall correctly, in that anniversary special, Evil Knievel got essentially the semi-main event positioning, right?
Yeah,
Like he came out like kind of on a motorcycle in front of the live crowd, but I think Muhammad Ali closed.
yeah. Muhammad Ali closed, and Evil. I get why they had him do it, but would you want to be in a soundstage with a Harley Davidson running?
I would not, no.
That just seems very toxic in a literal sense and loud. But they did. It was interesting because they played, these packages about these guys and women and didn't shy away from sort of the bad parts of their career. Like the Muhammad Ali one just flat out said at some point he should have retired.
Yeah,
Kept going, and then he came out and was all smiles. And I mean, it seemed like his health issues were at least in their early stages there.
it really did. Even in 1986, 4 or 5 years after his late retirement, that was more of a statement than anything you could say about him. Just comparing footage of him in 1986 against the footage that they showed of him in the 1970s.
Right, yeah.
But you're right; they did seem to get into some territory that showed that it wasn't 100% positive.
But the one about him was interesting too because, in one year, in 1966, he fought 6 fights, which I don't know a lot about boxing, but I know that's not how it works anymore.
No,
Well, especially with, he already had a title. So,
right.
now it's, what, 1 fight a year, maybe?
Yeah, maybe twice a year,
Yeah.
and of course it's on pay per view mostly.
Yep.
That's the other thing. I mean, the whole idea of championship boxing matches being shown on broadcast television that's come back a little bit in recent years for a variety of reasons. But back in Muhammad Ali's heyday, he was a network television star. And he made a lot of money off closed circuit or pay per view television, but you could see him quite a bit on ABC promoting his fights or actually fighting, which just again, it's a relic of a different era because boxing was obviously a lot bigger back then too.
Yeah. And I think he's a figure that, like we'll get into with Evel Knievel, was still a big part of pop culture when we were kids, although he was at the end of his career. But, between having a cartoon and the decon commercials and, whatever else, he still loomed large, I think.
Right. To me, it was more the cartoons, the guest appearances, the commercials. Muhammad Ali as a celebrity
Right.
was more what I grew up with rather than Muhammad Ali as a boxer.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, exactly. He was probably the biggest star of World of Sports, I think. Definitely loomed large as a cultural superstar way past his prime.
Yeah. Yeah. Other thoughts on Wide World of Sports? Would you like to see it now? Would you like that kind of show to be on now?
It would be interesting. It just seems to me like you could do it even now if it was produced a certain way. But I don't think I would be interested in it. There just isn't enough. There's enough sports. It's hard for me to say. I guess the short answer is no.
Okay.
But I'm watching less sports than I did before anyway, and it just seems with so many different options, I think I would have a hard time sitting down and watching things. Like even going back and watching on YouTube some of the old Wide World of Sports, I got irritated whenever it was auto racing. It seemed like a lot of what people have saved is and shared with the rest of the world is auto racing, and I'm grateful that they did it, but I just have no interest in that. So any anthology format would probably turn me off. Like a lot of the sports that they would show, I just wouldn't be interested in. Might not have the patience to sit for something that I actually did want to watch.
Now, auto racing, there's something, if I were watching a sports show and that were on and they cut away, I would be happy.
Yeah.
Like to have it reduced
Right.
to just a portion of the show instead of the full thing, that might appeal to me.
One clip in particular, I think I was telling you about that I started to watch because it had the original commercials.
Uh-huh.
And I think it was actually the Daytona 500, which now would be a standalone event. But it started with Jim McKay talking about some dangerous, like bobsled type event.
Right.
And I was like, wow, that looks really cool. But they start with the racing, and they'd cut to, okay, now let's go to Jim McKay, and he was going to talk about, show some of this sledding footage, and nope, that was edited out, and we went right back to the auto racing. So I got kind of irritated.
What do you think of Jim McKay? I think you already said something nice about him, but in general, what are your thoughts on him?
Not having, by the time I was really watching sports, even the Olympics, he was maybe more of that host role. I remembered him more as an elder statesman, so I don't have as much of a fondness of him because I don't have a lot of like actual event coverage memory of watching him. I think he's the consummate professional, but then again, I have years and years of reading and seeing other people refer to him as a consummate professional.
Right.
Or professional. So I can tell he's excellent at what he does, and I actually loved him on that special when he couldn't resist talking about the billiards, his billiards
Oh
background.
yeah, yeah.
That was in that nice little segment. But I think he's pretty cool. I admire him. He doesn't seem to be. He seems to be. I'm sure he had some kind of ego, but he seems to do a good job of making it about the event, not about himself, in my opinion, which I respect.
And now I don't have an issue with him, but I think when I was a kid, when he was on the Olympics, he bothered me a little bit, and I'm not sure if he bothered me, but or I'm pretty sure my dad didn't like him,
Really?
and I'm not sure why, other than that he said he had beady eyes. I don't know. Maybe he had had some run in with him and he had been a jerk. He had a situation with Brent Musburger like that, where Brent Musburger was at the place he worked, and my dad tried to talk to him, and he didn't give him the time of day.
Mm.
So that meant he was a jerk.
Well, to him, he was a jerk. It
Yes.
sounds like.
Yeah. So maybe there was some other situation, or maybe I don't know. But I know my dad watched Wide World of Sports, so I guess he just put up with him.
Yeah, Jim McKay was the one constant presence in that show for
Yeah.
many years. He'd go all around the globe and all kinds of different things, but McKay was the one guy you'd see pretty much every week, I think.
Yeah. I hope my memory's right in that. And not that I want my dad to have disliked someone for beady eyes, but I'm pretty sure that's true. Or at least that
Yeah,
was.
there may have been some root cause
Yes.
that led to him to find reasons to criticize him. I don't. Most people seem to revere him though.
Yeah.
And especially within the industry.
We've mentioned Cosell and Don Meredith and Keith Jackson and
Al Michaels,
Frank
big
Gifford.
announcers, Frank Gifford, yes.
So quite a crew they had, and of course all the experts on various specific topics. Dick Button on ice skating and the various gymnasts and things. So quite a crew there.
Yeah, they would treat it as one of their. They put a lot of production into it. And I think, as we'll get into when we talk about some of these Evel Knievel events.
Yeah.
As revolutionary as some of these techniques might have been, and as good as the production was then, it looks kind of primitive now.
Sure.
And I think it's kind of disappointing to watch some of these events through modern eyes. But they did put top talent where possible. A lot of times, I guess it was young talent, but the Howard Cosell was their biggest star in the 1970s, and they wanted him on Wide World of Sports, and maybe just as importantly, he wanted to be on Wide World of Sports.
Oh.
So that shows you how prestigious the show was.
Yeah.
That Howard Cosell, thought it worthy of his time,
Right.
despite being part of Monday Night Football, thinking himself bigger than the network many times maybe.
But if Ali was going to be there, he was going to be there.
Right.
Joined at the hip, those guys. Yeah, well, maybe we can start to transition to Evel here. I think I read about there was an announcement that USA was going to do a TV series or mini series that has since been not greenlit, but it just reminded me that Evel Knievel was this presence in the 70s. Now, as we looked into it, and I realized that essentially his career was done by the time I was 4. So I am curious how he stuck around. Some of it, his toys lingered, and that's an interesting aspect. An athlete back then who had toys, or if we're going to call him an athlete, but a figure like that, a sports figure who had toys. And now searching YouTube, it was hard to find full episodes of Wide World of Sports where he appeared, but we did find a ESPN Classic collection of many of his jumps from those episodes, and he's a fascinating figure. I don't care about motorcycles. I don't care about jumping things, but he's this interesting mix to me of different sort of American archetypes. Part of it is the sort of gunslinger thing, and part of it is a little bit of a confidence man, a sort of Barnum or something. But it's a mix because he really did what he purported to do. So there wasn't fakery going on, but he had that showman aspect. Figured out that, if I want to make this work, I need to be on TV. And if I want to be on TV, I need to be on Wide World of Sports. And he got himself on Wide World of Sports.
Right.
Which is pretty clever of him. Well, so I watched that. I watched a lot of ancillary material too, including a pretty fun documentary called Being Evil, which is on IMDb TV. It was only from a couple years ago that Johnny Knoxville was involved in. And you learn a lot about him. He was not a saint by any means, although he, was out there preaching, don't use drugs and always wear a helmet. But he could be a pretty rough customer. And in his childhood in Butte, Montana, he was kind of or adolescence, he was a bit of a rogue, a little bit of a petty criminal, and supposedly got his name while he was in jail overnight least the story they told there was he was in jail, and the other guy in jail was named Knaufel, and they dubbed him Evel Knievel and Awful Knaufel. But he liked riding motorcycles, and he turned it into this weird job.
Mike, is there any truth to the rumor that Fred Silverman hired Awful Kanoffel to do a bunch of specials for NBC in the late 70s?
I wish there.
Doesn't it seem like something that would have happened?
Yeah, he would have gone to
I don't know
Butte.
what happened to Awful Kanoffel, unfortunately. But
No, I don't either. So Evil in the late '60s, he had like a motorcycle stunt riding team. So what he did was not necessarily a new thing, but he convinced the organizer of a big race to let him be like the pre-show entertainment, and that was the race was going to be on Wide World of Sports, and they filmed him and put him on. And then not long after that, he attempted his famous jump of the fountains at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, where he had a terrible accident that was caught on film. But even that, like, he just decided he was going to do it, and then apparently kept calling Caesar's Palace, pretending to be various people from the press, talking him up. And
wow.
and people at Caesar's Palace, like, were just like, well, we guess we have a contract with him.
Wow.
But the footage of that, and especially the accident, really put him on the scene. Like,
Which is amazing. Like,
yeah,
sort of like an arguable failure.
right.
He turned that into something, and that's the one where he flips over and like kind of lands on his head, and
It's awful.
it's difficult to watch. Like, I
Yeah.
almost couldn't get through it the ninth or 10th time I watched it. I almost had to turn my head. It was so bad, but
Right. Yeah.
it really is ghastly.
Yeah.
It's good for him though to turn that into something, but it's spectacular in a sense. But
Yeah. People wanted to see him make the jump, but they also wanted to see him not make the jump. And for like 10 years, he was a huge deal, and had, again, had toys and comic books, and made a lot of money, and spent a lot of it on yachts and special cars and a big house, and women. I mean, he was married and had kids, but he was apparently quite the womanizer. And he had these ridiculous his leather jumpsuits and giant belt buckles and capes and walking sticks, and be on all the talk shows.
And the I think the red, white, and blue motif
Yeah,
of his costume was important too, especially like in the bicentennial
yeah,
1970s, and a time when America was conscious of its own identity and celebrating its identity. He came along with that outfit at the same time. And much as it pains me to say, I think the Dallas Cowboys was sort of their blue and white, and kind of tying themselves into America, and self-declaring them to be America's team, kind of, and things like that. Evil seems to fit right into that whole landscape.
yeah. I think so. Now, I think both in the ESPN special and the documentary, there's a Wide World of Sports producer who his theory that he posits, that I don't entirely buy, but that there is something so authentic and honest about a guy like doing this thing that might kill him, that it spoke to people in a time where they had lost their faith in the government, and it just, the turbulent times of the late '60s and the early to mid '70s.
Yeah, and you talk about a narrative. I think in the ESPN special, that was something that came up several times. Was there's even footage of Evil saying it himself. I think, like, well, he did what he was going to do. He always says what he's going to do. He keeps his word.
Right.
I thought that was an interesting emphasis, and if that is the thing that stands out for Evel Knievel, I think you can definitely fit it into the 1970s when, yeah, people were losing faith in the institutions. But I'm not so sure that was his essential appeal. Maybe that's what he wanted to put out there. But do you think that the nation at large was captivated by him because he kept his word?
I think it was just because he was doing crazy stuff and might die.
Yeah.
and then had this low key but yet bigger than a personality that was both low key and not, larger than life, but in a very monotone way.
Now, what do you think about that? Because in this particular special, there was a lot of sort of post-event interview footage, and I was struck by the difference between the persona of the bravado and everything,
Yeah.
and the humility, the surface humility,
Right.
he showed after each jump.
Yeah.
He said the right things, almost like when an athlete who gives thanks to the Lord above, or thanks his family and everything, and seems very humble. Evil was not he didn't come off as Muhammad Ali boasting about things. He came off as very just thankful to be there, respectful, talking to, giving thanks to people for showing up, giving thanks to his crew. And I was struck by that. Do you think that was sincere?
I think maybe it was. I think maybe when he, like, in the heat of the moment, of doing that thing, he took it seriously and was humble about it. But then had the showman part of him that could do the pre-show and be not humble and could go on talk shows and be a bit of a braggart. And some of it is maybe not false humility, but that sort of, I don't want to say exactly a humble brag thing, but if you see him on a talk show kind of being nonchalant about what he does, there's an element of that seems humble and bragging at the same time,
Hmm.
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, and part of it too probably is that a lot of his jumps ended in failure
Yeah,
or partial failure. So it's probably hard to be bragging too much when people are seeing you wipe out
right.
a lot of the time, and that's part of your appeal. Maybe is the fact that you're not successful all the time.
Yeah,
I still think it's interesting though. I think if you were to just read like the outline of Evel Knievel's career and see, okay, he's a daredevil and he's doing all this stuff, you would have one picture of him. But if you actually watched this edited footage and saw the way he his actual words, not pre-event but post-event, and in the heat of it, he comes off as a totally different guy than what you would expect. I think.
yeah, yeah, I think so. And but then like so there's the Wembley jump where he's jumping buses. I think he actually does jump them, but the landing is unsuccessful and he has a pretty bad accident. That was where he announced to the crowd that that was his last jump. But he's still, he's really terribly injured, and he still has the whatever presence of mind to do that, which might have been honest or might have been a bit of showmanship, but he did have the showmanship of help me up and I want to walk out. And there's even footage of like Frank Gifford has him by the arm and they're getting to the tunnel of the arena and he's like, oh, let's go ahead and get the stretcher. And he's like, no, we walked in here, we're walking out.
Yeah.
And he's clearly barely incapable of that. His face is all banged up. And but that's a showman instinct there.
It is. It's almost like a John Wayne kind of
Yeah.
a little bit of swagger, even in the face of semi defeat.
Yes.
And Gifford, if Evel Knievel had an equivalent of Cosell to Ali, I guess it would have to be Frank Gifford.
Yeah, and it seems like they were friends of some sort too. But
And I think he's the one that exclaims, "Oh my God!"
Yeah.
As and that particular jump in Wembley.
And that's the jump before it, like that Evel Knievel's like, "Well, I've never had an accident with you here, Frank." So
Yeah. And Frank says something like, "It's not going to happen today," or something like that.
yeah,
He's reassuring him.
right,
There's sort of a different dynamic. I mean, when you're covering these events, I'm sure it's not like you're just doing a football game, which has its own element of danger. But when you're talking about one person out there doing something that could very well kill him, there's a totally different thing going on.
yeah,
One thing I kind of want to interject here, Mike,
yeah,
kind of going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, is it fair to say that the 1970s was maybe the age of daredevils? So Evil sort of fits in there, and maybe when we're talking about what was his appeal, maybe you could broaden it out. This was the time when you had like human fly,
right,
like people climbing walls or people tightrope walking
yeah,
between buildings, and even I think the 1970s was the age of like skyjacking, right?
hmm,
Which it was a criminal act, but there's some kind of daredevil element to that. So
yeah,
it seems almost like it was kind of a faddish thing, and I was too young to really be aware of all this stuff now. But looking back, maybe that was part of it. For some reason, people, maybe not just in the United States, but all over the globe, there was this sort of this appetite for these daredevil acts and these daredevil personas.
Well, everyone is reading the comic Daredevil,
Ah, yes,
and
that's exactly true. Yes.
yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I feel like there are other periods, at least in America, where that was sort of a thing, like the escape artist age and it's sort of like pole sitting and all of that kind of weird stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like riding horses off of platforms into pools of water?
Say what now?
You must have seen that footage before.
I've probably, yeah.
I forget what they call that, but
That's not water polo, is it?
no, that's not water.
Okay.
Water polo is riding seahorses, giant seahorses, and yeah. So yeah, maybe there was something in the air of just like the world's in chaos. Let's do these crazy things.
I do think your point is well taken, though. I think it's a little easy to come up with these after the fact narratives, to use that word again, and
Yes.
kind of retrofit everything with the advantage of hindsight. Back then, I still think like most of it was just okay. Maybe the right guy at the right time. Maybe there was some element of it.
Right. Now what he did seem to do was make sort of the Daredevil thing more mainstream, like not a carnival act. And part of that was by being on TV. And then the documentary made a large point of that. In a way, he's sort of the godfather of action or extreme sports.
Hmm.
Like a lot of what they're doing now is not that dissimilar to what he did, but it essentially is mainstream.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
I mean, it's in the some of that stuff's in the Olympics.
Right. Yeah, and with judging,
Yeah,
like sort of having these kind of stunts and leaps be judged on artistic merit and athletic achievement, things like that, is seems to stem from, but is also kind of a far cry from one guy by himself just trying to jump over 18 cars without killing himself.
right. And I think that whether it's a tapping into the psyche of concern in the 70s or not is really that's the appeal, right? It's
Mm.
again, it's like the cowboy thing, or even to some extent the sort of superhero thing. Like it's one guy against insurmountable odds, and it's just him and his skill and his steel horse.
Yes.
And when it comes down to it, there, I mean, there's lots of preparation and getting the ramps right and all of that, but it's still nothing else is going to be there once he once he starts up that ramp. Nothing else can help him.
Right.
It's just him versus gravity.
And speaking of the ramps, it's interesting that most of these jumps, he's going from a ramp and then landing on a ramp, hopefully, on the other end. So sort of a ramp to ramp kind of thing. And it's interesting, like the visual aspect of it. And it seems like a lot of times the jumping wasn't so difficult as much as the landing,
Right.
that you alluded to. A lot of times that's where he would really run into trouble. He'd clear his objective, often some kind of vehicle for some reason. I wonder what the thought process was is to go, going cars and then buses. But
It takes fewer buses to create a longer distance.
yes.
And the Wembley thing, they didn't talk about this in the ESPN deal, but they advertised it as him jumping English buses, which brought to mind double-decker buses.
Of course, yeah.
So there would be a height, and then they weren't.
No.
But there's a little bit of that, and that he also like ticket sales were poor, and he spent all week just driving around England, sort of glad handing people, and ended up selling like 90,000 tickets.
Wow.
So he did have some charisma. Now, maybe his most infamous act in terms of the stunts was the attempt to jump Snake River Canyon in the Sky Cycle. So that is interesting in a lot of ways to me. That one, it aired a week after it happened on Wide World of Sports. So first it aired in closed circuit pay-per-view in movie theaters, the live event. And also this Sky Cycle thing, this rocket deal, the way it's described in that documentary is essentially it's like a boiler and just taking the cap off a boiler, like you might see in a cartoon. So it's just steam powered. But that whole event too was like just a strange thing. Like he was not in a good place. He was drinking a lot. He got in fights with the press. They like really saw the bad side of him, which his sort of his cohorts had already seen a lot of. That he between sort of fame and some other things, like there was a jump at the Cow Palace in San Francisco where he had been bad-mouthing Hell's Angels. And after he landed, some Hell's Angels ran on the floor of the Cow Palace and started to beat him up.
Wow.
And then Evil's peoples went out there and were beating them up, and it was a whole like giant melee. So at the Snake River thing, by then he was kind of paranoid and the pressure of it, and he just wasn't pleasant a lot of the time. And then on top of that, it became like this nightmare sort of Woodstock scene where like 30,000 people showed up, and a lot of them were bikers. And this is all in the documentary that they were walking around naked and having sex in public, and there'd be rapes and violence, and this high school marching band came to play, and they were harassing them. And one of these people in the band, as an adult, was telling his story, and I did laugh because he was a tuba player, and he said they were just stuffing things in his tuba. But then he told a story about them sort of like pulling a majorette's clothes off or something, and it's like, okay, that's not so funny. But then like one of the promoters involved, not the main one, but there was a rock promoter involved too, and he ended up hiring the Hells Angels to do some security because they were worried about people running off the edge of the canyon.
Because that worked so well for the Rolling Stones.
Yes.
Years earlier at Altamont.
Right. But it did kind of work. They put up a fence too, but that seemed like that was a real possibility that all these people, to see what happened, would run off the edge of this canyon.
And this is near, Twin Falls, Idaho?
Yeah. I've seen that canyon and looked down the edge of it, and it's a gorgeous place, but it's like I don't know, half a mile deep or something or more.
I could be wrong, but I would guess that the community, the greater Twin Falls community, was not used to holding events like this, like chaotic events like this. This is possibly his most famous event, right? And to me, as a television production, I think I really noticed the limitations of what 1976, just television in general. But it's hard to watch. It's hard to actually discern what's happening to him. I think part of it was there was definitely a fog going on for everybody, but it was unclear. So after the parachute deploys, and he's descending, it's actually physically hard to see what's happening to him and where he's even landing. And it seems like nowadays, if you're going to bother televising an event like that, you're going to have cameras all over the place, multiple angles, things like this. In this case, they have a replay, but it's still kind of hard for them to tell what's going on, which is a little understandable. And we were watching edited footage of this, but to me, it's just like I can't really see what's going on. It must have been frustrating. Well, maybe not at the time if people stand for it, but now it's frustrating watching this because like I can't imagine paying to see this.
Right.
The only thing is you're seeing whether a guy lives or dies,
Yeah.
to put it in a ghoulish way, but you're not getting spectacular visual presentation of what's actually going on.
Yeah, like they should have probably had, or they would have now had cameras in the river, like on boats or something, on the other side of the canyon, which maybe they did and just didn't show that footage.
Yeah, it's possible.
But you can hear them; they're showing it, and they're like, stay with it," like keeping the camera on the sky cycle as it descends. Yeah, an interesting thing, and I guess maybe the closed circuit thing didn't work very well, or they didn't sell a lot of tickets. But in a way, that was the beginning and the end of his career. But the main promoter who worked with him, Shelley Saltman, then wrote a book about it that he had permission to write, and he had recorded all his conversations with Evil. And in the book, he revealed some not flattering aspects of Evil. And Evil's lawyers approved it, but when Evil found out, when he looked at it or read it after it had come out, he was not happy, and he went to LA. This Shelley Saltman by then was working for 20th Century Fox, and then Evil was, as we were talking about, was recovering from an injury. Like both of his arms were broken, but he somehow managed to beat this guy with an aluminum baseball bat. And that ultimately was the end because
Yeah,
he went to jail for 6 months, although he did ridiculous things like he was on work release and got picked up in a limo every day, and then he hired limos to pick up everyone else who was on work release, and he made a show of that too.
I'm intrigued by this whole event, and like you said, he went out to find him. It wasn't like he ran into him at a Shoney's or something like that.
No,
Happened to have a couple of aluminum baseball bats in his trunk
yeah,
or strapped to his motorcycle for the occasion. He went out, it shows predetermination. And if he did have both arms broken, I mean, on one hand, you could say, well, I mean, maybe he had some kind of like sleazy attorney that tried to, use that as a point. Like, how could he do this when he's clearly,
all right,
he'd walk into court with his in a full body cast or something like that. But on the other hand, you must be pretty mad at somebody,
yeah,
and that shows total predetermination with those injuries to go ahead and attempt to and succeed in beating somebody up that brutally. That's amazing.
yeah, and to be that mad for a sustained period because he had to fly. Now I think he had his own plane, but still he had to fly. Let's say from Idaho or Montana, where he lived, to L.A. That's it got to be a few hours at least.
Yeah.
Fuming and find the guy on the studio lot, have some guys hold him back and beat him
Did,
up.
did he like check in at the studio lot at the gate and introduce himself as Evel Knieval, with his arms in casts and somehow riding a motorcycle with his teeth and with a baseball bat strapped to his shoulders?
Right, yeah.
I would like to have seen that picture.
Oh, yeah.
This kind of killed his career,
It kind of, yeah.
his image.
It definitely killed his money stream because Ideal Toys canceled the toy line. I think once he got convicted, they did. Or at least they canceled it here. Maybe they still did in Europe, but that's wild. I know he was around as something in the ether when we were kids, and I still don't know why, if he was done. I mean, like my brother said one of our neighbors had the toy,
Mm-hmm.
so I think that helped, and maybe he talked him up or something, but it just seemed like he was still around.
I think somehow, me as a kid, I think we've talked about it before in the podcast probably, I'd get my hands on older comic books.
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily read at the time, but I had like a lot of late 70s comics or maybe some that my dad had. And I remember seeing those Ideal Toy ads in the comic books, I think.
Yeah.
And I remember him as a toy character, more than a Daredevil or even a TV personality. Yeah, it's the same thing. I remember, and I think for me, as simplistic as this sounds, a big part of it is the name.
Yeah.
Like the name was almost shorthand for a Daredevil. I guess maybe because of his promotion, but I think somehow he was lived on as a punchline, not as a mocking punchline, but if somebody wants to make a joke about doing something foolish or reckless, you say Evel Knieval, and it just sounded so cool, and the name was so interesting that had to have been a big part of it. But yeah, I'm not quite sure either. But it seemed like in the early part of the '80s he was around, and then maybe towards the later part of the decade, I don't really remember him being a thing as much.
No. So, as I said, I did watch some ancillary material, which included an episode of The Bionic Woman where he plays himself. And in it, he's in Germany, I guess in Berlin, doing a performance, and she's there to stop some KGB guys from stealing they've stolen a computer tape, and she has to retrieve it. And Evil finishes up his jump and everything, and he's leaving just on his motorcycle, and she thinks he's German and jumps on his motorcycle and has them. They chase his car, and they end up in East Germany, and he keeps telling her, "Listen, lady, I'm Evel Knievel," and she doesn't believe him, and it's pretty ridiculous. And he inexplicably he knows German, so that helps. And they end up briefly imprisoned to be interrogated, but it's in the building where the tape is, and they manage to get the tape, and he dresses up as a KGB guard or an East German guard.
Wow.
And they end up escaping, this won't surprise you, by doing a massive jump over the border.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
I'm very glad to hear that.
And she finally believes him. And then it seemed like at the end they were going on a date.
Ooh.
Which seems the world of fictional Evel Knievel, he isn't married. And he makes some joke about maybe the next time he gets in an accident, he'll see her doctor. So he's not a very good actor.
No.
His charisma does not carry over. And this is on further display in the wonderfully bad movie Viva Knievel. So this movie should appeal to Battle of the Network shows fans. It was a theatrical movie. So the cast includes Evel Knievel as himself, the great Gene Kelly as his washed up former mentor, who's now an alcoholic mechanic with a 10-year-old son in 1976.
A lot going on there.
Yeah. And Lauren Hutton as a sort of a war photographer type person who comes to take pictures of him, and they have this weird flirtation that really doesn't work at all, but the movie puts them together anyway. The main villain is Leslie Nielsen, who's a drug dealer, and he's partnered with Albert Salmi.
Right.
And most importantly,
Albert Salmi.
Yes, I knew a lot of this cast, but I was pleasantly surprised to see him. But most importantly, and by the way, he gets the "and" credit in the credits, Marjoe Gortner.
Yes.
As Jesse. So Jesse is Evil's former protege and a bit of a hophead, you might say, a junkie, a fiend, and he's in partnership with Leslie Nielsen and Albert Salmi to get. This is a very convoluted thing. They want to get Evel to go to Mexico with them on a tour. They're going to copy his famous trailer. He had this trailer that would show up at all his shows that had his motorcycle and everything in it, and so they want to copy that. In Mexico, they're going to rig his motorcycle to have an accident, and he'll die, and then using the fake trailer, they'll bring him back, and the wall of the trailer will be lined with heroin.
What a scheme.
It seems very specific. And also, when they're in Mexico, Dabney Coleman plays a shady administrator at a sanitarium.
Sounds brilliant.
Yeah. So it's a really terrible movie. But one, it has a song called Viva Knievel, and two, it has all those people in it. And Leslie Nielsen, I was telling my brother, he asked me, he's like, is it even possible to watch Leslie Nielsen in a dramatic thing and take him seriously? And I was like, certainly not in this. Because he's, it's only a couple years before Airplane, so he looks exactly the same.
Yeah.
And is delivering all his lines the exact same way. And a bit of a spoiler, but he and Albert Salmi die in a fiery car crash.
Oh.
Off the side of a mountain, of course.
Oh.
As all villains in motorcycle-based movies
Mm.
should when they go to Mexico. So if you're interested in any of these things, I would recommend watching this.
Let me ask you this:
Yeah.
Is Angie Dickinson and some other women waiting for Leslie Nielsen and Albert Salmi to come back across the border?
If they are, we don't see them. Maybe there was a different movie where that happened. I think Lauren Hutton might be the only woman in the movie as a regular cast member. I mean, there are some people like there's a scene where right before this car crash where they're chasing him, Evil. He's on a motorcycle, of course, through like a Mexican village, and he's just like tearing up the place. He at one point he drives into a little cantina and knocks over all these tables and things, and then drives out, and it's wild.
Wow.
And unfortunately, though, he brings the same lack of charisma to it that he brought to the Bionic Woman.
It doesn't always translate to screen for sure.
No, he one of my favorite lines too is so at some point they to shut up Gene Kelly's character they inject him with heroin, and that's why he gets put in the sanitarium. And Evil's like he says this isn't quite the language, but it's something like he might be an alcoholic, but he's no addict.
Ah.
Which I think mostly just shows that maybe the thinking was different then. But
Right. Well, as we've come across many times in our podcast history, there's a distinction made between hard and other drugs.
yes,
Like cocaine was quite common, but oh, that's not heroin.
right.
You could be using cocaine all the time. It's like, well, that's not a drug addict. That's just somebody doing a little coke.
Yeah, but heroin is a stigma.
Yes.
I didn't get to watch the George Hamilton biopic though.
Well, that may not be much of a loss.
No.
George Hamilton does not seem anything like Evel Knievel in any sense of what I know about Evel or George Hamilton.
No. Nope.
I remember seeing the Viva Knievel a long time ago, and I think you did a good job of summarizing it. I don't remember a whole lot about it, but it's clear that not everybody can have charisma off and on screen like a Marjo Gortner. So,
right.
and maybe Evel was not one of those people. The one thing I still kind of want to see, even though you've warned me against it, I still kind of want to see that Bionic Woman episode.
Yeah.
Now, who do you think would be, if you're putting like your dream 70s couples, if you put Farrah Fawcett and Lee Majors up against Evel Knievel and the Bionic Woman, do you still have to give it to Farrah and Lee Majors?
Ooh. Probably, yeah.
It's tough, though.
I don't know. I mean, I think I like the Bionic Woman more than Farrah Fawcett, but yeah, I would still probably.
I put you on the spot there, didn't I?
That is, yeah, that's almost too much to handle.
Yeah, I apologize. That's a tough question.
Yeah.
Just came up, but
I would definitely pick Evel Knievel and the Bionic Woman over Evel Knievel and Lauren Hutton.
yeah.
And now, for some reason, when I originally read about that and saw her name, I got it in my head it was Faye Dunaway. And it seemed really bizarre that Faye Dunaway in 1977 would be doing this crappy movie. Lauren Hutton made more sense.
Yeah,
I mean, just...
Sure, I can say that. Yeah, Lauren Hutton is another kind of more 1970s sort of icon, more of the time. That's interesting. Now, I'd kind of like to just mention, while we're talking about Evel, my personal favorite of the jumps that we saw in Wide World of Sports over the years, or just Evel jumps in general. You know what my favorite is, I think? The LA Memorial Coliseum jump.
Oh, yeah.
Where he's kind of going on a ramp, like descending from the top of the stadium.
Yeah.
And kind of just going through the seats, through the stands, basically, and doing a big jump. I thought that was just a fantastic visual.
Yeah.
I think that's my favorite of all the ones.
Now, in this movie, one of the jumps he does is over a number of cages of lions and tigers, which apparently he did some of that. Well, he was going to jump sharks, and that didn't work out. But
literally jump sharks.
Yes, literally jump sharks. He also, in the documentary, they tell a story about him jumping a bunch of containers of rattlesnakes.
Containers of rattlesnakes.
Container or tubs or something there, but they're rattlesnakes. And the end of a jump, like he made the jump, but like the back of his tire hit the container and flung them into the crowd.
What?
Yeah. And he was fine, but some people were freaked out.
Yeah, it's funny because one of the things that Lori and I were talking about while we were watching some of this Evel footage was, what kind of spectacle was this for the live crowd? Was it really worth buying a ticket to see something that would last like maybe 10 seconds? I mean, even if there's other events and things, but now I know, well, you've also got it, you're paying $25 and you also got a chance of being, assaulted with a flying rattlesnake.
Yeah, so you might die, not just him.
But, okay, that adds to it a little bit.
Yeah. There must have been his whole crew and his kids and stuff doing other stunts beforehand.
Yeah.
Plus, a lot of build up. He rides up to the top of the ramp to check it out. At least in the movie, which may or may not be accurate, he comes out and he does a bunch of wheelies and stuff, and then he goes back and switches bikes. So he's got like a wheelie bike and a jump bike, and then he comes back out.
Ah, we don't. I don't know how accurate that is, like you said, but that actually might be a lot of value in the movie. As we mentioned, that we couldn't find like complete original episodes of Wide World of Sports, so maybe the movie is more of an accurate representation of what people actually saw. I don't know if Wide World of Sports would show all the buildup or if they would treat it as just one of the events and just maybe cut to the chase a little bit. But they said in a special, and it holds up with other sources too, that he was one of their most highest rated attractions. So
Mm-hmm.
I could see maybe them breaking format a little bit to build whole episodes around Evel Knievel too. But yeah, on this special we were watching, we were pretty much just seeing the actual jumps and maybe a little bit of pre and post footage, but not the whole build up and everything that people might have seen it back in the 1970s. I think another thing we can point out too is that this is another motif in ESPN Classic special, which was hosted by Chris Fowler, by the way, who's now ABC's #1 college football announcer. But this was many years ago. But I think they stressed the fact that Evil had to keep topping himself. And you can kind of see that, like the Snake River Canyon jump was maybe his artistic peak. And once you do that, if you go back to jumping cars indoors, there might be some kind of letdown unless you keep trying to top it somehow. And I think one thing I read was that he took some of the risks out of his jumps so that they were maybe try to add some elements like boxes of rattlesnakes or cages of animals to make it more visually interesting without adding to the actual physical risk. Maybe something that looked more exciting or dangerous than it actually was. But I think at a certain point, he couldn't really top himself anymore. He couldn't physically do it.
Yeah.
Once you jump, maybe 17 or 18 cars, you can't jump 25 cars. And the Snake River Canyon thing might have been the thing that ultimately led to the decline. That was probably the peak artistically, right? Because unless he could get rights to do the Grand Canyon, how can you do that? Although part of me does wonder, I guess if the numbers were disappointing, you'd think maybe, well, I guess he didn't ever want to do anything like that again, maybe.
Yeah, and I think it cost a lot of money too. I think he made a lot of money, but it cost a lot of money.
Okay.
But and like the Wembley bus thing where he didn't quite make it, was 13 buses. So he did one at Kings Island that was 14 buses because 13's unlucky, and he did make that one. That was his last sort of big successful jump.
You know what he should have done? He should have actually jumped the Brady Bunch at Kings Island because that was the amusement park where they went in the fifth season.
Right.
If he would have lined, let's see, 6 kids plus Mike, Alice, and Carol.
That's 9 people.
That's 9 people. That's pretty. What a visual it would make, though.
Yeah, and Tiger.
Yeah, throw in Cousin Oliver, maybe Sam the Butcher.
I'm surprised, that the Brady Bunch didn't meet Evel Knievel somehow.
Especially on the Variety Hour, that would have been a natural. Maybe that did happen. We'll have to have the crack research team look it up. It could have happened, I think, at some point.
Yeah. So there were some Hanna-Barbera cartoons sort of based on him, right?
That Devlin, was it?
Yeah.
I think that used to be on Cartoon Express. Honestly, I think that was one of the ones I'd skip when it would come on Cartoon Express. I never really got into
I'm assuming, at least one of the characters looked like Shaggy.
it.
I might be thinking of, what was their talking car or living car one?
Speed Buggy?
Speed Buggy, yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of cartoons like that in the 1970s.
Yeah. And I don't even know, I mean, I know there was a Marvel comic. I don't know if that was a one-shot or what the deal was. But
Yeah, do you remember the Team America comic in the 80s with... It had like stunt bikers or something like that?
I think so. Was US 1 involved in that somehow too?
Maybe. I think I had like the first issue of Team America. I think it was a toy tie-in actually. And I think it got like a really big push at the beginning and then fizzled pretty quickly. I don't know if it was because the comic failed or the toy line failed. It must have been because the toy line failed.
Right.
But it seemed like that may have been part of that tradition too, with the American branding and colors and kind of the excitement and daredevil aspect.
No, there's another thing I meant to mention that I think we can blame Evel Knievel pretty much 100% for the rise in motorcycle popularity in the 70s.
Blame, you say?
Yes.
Do you still have some residual anger from season 7, Mike?
Well, it just seems like motorcycles come up a lot, and they take up a lot of time.
Yeah, they do.
Because it's not just Pray for the Wildcats, but Chips and Captain America, and
yeah.
Guaranteed there was some Evel Knieval influence on the Captain America movies.
Yes, that I'm very glad you mentioned that. I think you have to be right. I mean, Reb Brown is his own man, of
Right.
course, but the producers were clearly influenced by the Evel Knievel phenomenon.
Yeah.
Well, did you have a favorite jump of Evel's that was most exciting to you?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm complaining about motorcycles, but they are exciting to watch because the jumps are short. So
Yeah, especially in clip format,
yes.
like a compilation where you don't have to deal with all the
Yeah.
ballyhoo.
If he had made that Snake River, that would have been pretty exciting.
It would have been a great visual, probably.
Yeah.
Even with limited cameras, it still would have looked cool. You're seeing them go over a canyon.
Yeah, yeah. And, he originally wanted to do that on a motorcycle somehow. And they figured out that was not possible. So,
Yeah, I'm glad they workshopped that before they actually tested it on a motorcycle.
it sounded very Coyote.
Yeah.
Like attaching rockets to a motorcycle. Yeah, that seems like a guaranteed disaster.
Yeah, but think of the tie-in deal he could have had with Acme.
Yeah.
He would have pre-sold, all the marketing. He could have made money before he even got on the rocket.
Well, yeah, in that documentary, I think it's maybe Robbie, his son. One of his sons talks about how he was sort of at the forefront of licensing like that, at least for sort of athletics and things like that, and auto racing and all of that. And he had a lot of sponsors, and they were on his truck and things. And I know Chuckles Candy was one of them.
There's some cool commercials online of him for AMF bikes, I think. It seemed like children's bikes. I think I was watching one, like even like a tricycle and these different variations and stuff, maybe like a big wheel kind of thing. So, yeah, he knew how to promote himself.
Yep.
I think for me, I haven't really thought about him a lot in recent years, I will say. And I think the one thing, like, I think the last big word I would say on Evel, if I may, can I quote my son, who was watching a lot of this with me? And there was one, I can't remember around which race or jump this was, but they were showing people, it might have been, in Idaho, but they were interviewing people at the scene. And they had somebody, with a microphone asking them their thoughts on Evel Knievel. And you have one person say, oh, I think he's a hero.
Yeah.
The person, I think he's a man of his word. He does everything he says. And my son right away just said, I think he's an idiot. I'm not saying I agree with or disagree with that statement, but I think that says it all right there. Just the different reactions, but people had their different reasons for watching Evel Knievel, but they watched him. And my son was only paying half attention, but he was in the room, so I think that counts.
Well, kids they're forthright. They're not fooling around when they say stuff like that. So
no, they're not.
I might take his word on that. He laughed all the way to the bank and then lost all his money, but for a while there, he was a smart idiot.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean he wasn't an idiot.
No, he made a living, and presumably he was doing what he wanted to do and found a way to turn his vocation into a big money-making venture and got fame and success. So, he may have broke dozens of bones and had many near-death experiences, but he lived into his late 60s, I think, right? So,
yeah.
Long after he had stopped, exhibition jumping.
Yeah, and he had health problems that he had some that were related to his vocation, but I don't think those are the ones that got him. All right, I think that's a good wrap on Evel and the wide world of sports. We'll see you again next week.
This episode brought to you by the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat brand Orthotic Footwear. This episode also brought to you by motorcycles. Boy, we love them. This episode also brought to you by the Yellow Blazer Company for all your yellow blazer needs. Blazers available in ABC Yellow, Century 21 Gold, and Banana. Join us next time for another exciting episode of Battle of the Network Shows. Learn more, leave feedback, and suggest future episodes at battleofthenetworkshows.com. Follow us on Twitter at BatNetShows and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Battle of the Network Shows.